There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a long fight, not the silence of peace, the silence of exhaustion, of someone who has swung every punch they had, landed some, missed others, and finally lowered their arms. That is the silence surrounding Prince Harry now. Not defeat in the way his critics want to frame it, and not victory either. Something more complicated. Something more human. The legal campaign Harry waged against the British press for well over a decade has come to a close, and the way it ended tells us something important. Not just about a prince who stepped away from royal life, but about what it costs a person to spend years fighting institutions that helped shape everything they knew. The tabloid wars are over. What remains is the question of what they took from him, what he won, and who he is now that the courtrooms are empty. To understand where Harry stands today, you have to go back to the beginning, not of the lawsuits, but of the wound that made them inevitable. He was 12 years old when his mother died. He was walking behind her coffin in front of the entire world, a small boy in a suit, his face doing what the faces of children do when they are asked to perform grief instead of feel it, going still, going blank, carrying something that adults around him couldn't carry themselves. The cameras were everywhere, they always were, and the press that documented that walk, that printed those images, that sold those photographs to readers in every country, had also been chasing the car that crashed in Paris. That detail, documented in numerous accounts of the period, was something Harry would later say he never forgot. He grew up understanding that the press was not neutral, it was not even simply critical. In his experience, and in the experiences of his mother, as pieced together through the testimonies of those who knew her, the tabloid press was an active force in the shape of his family's life. Photographers camped outside homes, phones were hacked, private moments were printed without consent, sources within the royal household were cultivated. The line between news and surveillance was, by all credible accounts, barely a line at all. For years, Harry navigated this as royal life required, with a kind of surface cooperation, a management of access, a performance of tolerance. He attended events. He gave interviews. He smiled for cameras that he despised. And for a long time, the institution around him counseled the same approach it had always counseled. Don't engage, don't confirm, don't complain. The palace has always believed and still believes that the press is a necessary relationship managed best through proximity and cooperation rather than confrontation. Harry came to believe something different, and that divergence, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore, is at the root of everything that followed. There was a version of the story where it could have gone differently, where a young man's grief and distrust of the press remained private, managed, folded into the performance of duty the way it had been for every generation of royals before him, where the institution's instinct to absorb, to contain, to redirect, proved strong enough to hold him. It nearly did. For years, it nearly did. He went to Eton. He went to Sandhurst. He served in Afghanistan twice. He did the things a prince does. He wore the smile. He stood at the right angle to the cameras and gave the right amount of himself, which was always the carefully rationed amount. Never too much, never enough to be real. He understood that this was the arrangement. What he didn't know, or couldn't yet admit to himself, was how long he could keep it up. The moment observers most often point to as the turning point was not the wedding, and not the royal tour, and not even the decision to step back from frontline duties. It was the statement Harry and Meghan issued in October 2019, in which Harry publicly confirmed that he and his wife were pursuing legal action against the Mail on Sunday and directly addressed what he described as a campaign of harassment. The statement was remarkable not just for its content, but for its tone. It was personal. It was hurt. It broke with decades of palace protocol around press engagement. Royal observers noted at the time that it read less like a palace communication and more like something a person wrote when they had simply had enough. The legal action it announced over the publication of a private letter Meghan had written to her father would eventually result in a significant victory. The case went through the courts, through appeals, and ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled in Meghan's favor in 2021. The Mail on Sunday printed an apology. For many observers, it was a landmark moment. A senior royal had fought the press in court and won. It should have felt like resolution. It didn't feel that way, because by then, the architecture of their life had already changed completely. Harry and Meghan had announced their intention to step back from royal duties in January 2020, an announcement that caught the palace off guard, or at least that is how it was characterized by multiple sources in the months that followed. The decision to move to North America, to give up their HRH designations in a practical sense, to pursue independent income, was described by those close to the family as a fracture, by those close to Harry as an act of survival, and by the press as everything from a betrayal to a liberation, depending on which paper you were reading. The institution's response was characteristically measured in public and, by various accounts, considerably more complicated in private. What the tabloid campaign against them looked like in those months is now part of the public record. The coverage of Meghan in particular was cataloged in detail by media commentators, academics, and public watchdog organizations. Some coverage was critical in ways that any public figure might reasonably expect. Some of it, as documented in research comparing how different royal family members were covered, followed patterns that raised deeper questions. Harry watched it. He took notes. He kept records. This is not speculation. It is something he described himself in his memoir, published in January 2023, which became one of the best-selling books of that year and one of the most scrutinized. Spare was its own kind of confrontation with the press and with the royal family, and with a version of his past that Harry seemed determined to own on his own terms. It revealed details about family rifts, about palace communications, about physical altercations within the family that no royal had ever put into print before. It was criticized for its specificity and praised for its honesty, depending again on where you sat. What it was, unmistakably, was the product of someone who had decided that the game of careful ambiguity, so central to royal communication strategy, was no longer something he was willing to play. The book landed like a stone into still water. The ripples went out in all directions and haven't entirely settled. Commentators parsed every paragraph. Lawyers, family members, and courtiers were variously named, paraphrased, or characterized in ways that prompted denials and counterclaims. The palace maintained its policy of silence. King Charles and the Prince of Wales did not comment publicly on any of it. That restraint, that refusal to engage, was itself a kind of answer, one that Harry and his supporters read as proof of the very culture he had spent years trying to describe, and that the institution read, perhaps, as dignity, and yet even that was not the final chapter of the legal fight, because the biggest case was still unresolved. The lawsuit against News Group newspapers, the publisher of The Sun and the now defunct News of the World, had been building for years. Harry was among several public figures who alleged that their private information had been unlawfully obtained through phone hacking and other methods by journalists at those outlets. This was not a new allegation in British public life. The phone hacking scandal had shaken the British press to its foundations more than a decade earlier. It had resulted in the closure of the News of the World in 2011. It had led to the Leveson Inquiry, a sweeping examination of press culture and ethics that produced detailed findings and recommendations. Multiple journalists had faced criminal charges, but News Group itself had not been to trial over these allegations in the specific context of Harry's claims. Other defendants had settled. Other cases had been resolved. Harry had refused to settle. He said so repeatedly and publicly. He wanted the case heard. He wanted the evidence on record. He wanted, in the word he used in various contexts, accountability. That insistence on going to trial set him apart from almost everyone else who had made similar claims. Settling is what people do when the fight becomes too expensive, too exhausting, or too uncertain. Settling is rational. Settling ends the exposure and lets both sides move on. Harry knew all of this. His lawyers knew all of this, and he said no. He said no not once, but repeatedly, across years of pressure. Whatever you think of his choices in other areas of his life, that particular stubbornness, that refusal to take the easier road, is a fact that his critics have sometimes been slow to acknowledge. What happened next was one of the most closely watched legal developments in years. In December 2023, following a trial at the High Court in London, Mr. Justice Fancourt found in Harry's favor on some claims, ruling that there had been unlawful activities by journalists at the Mirror Group in a related case, and subsequently, that evidence supported Harry's allegations in the News Group proceedings. The details of those findings, as they emerged through the court process, were extensive and, to many observers, disturbing. They outlined alleged surveillance methods, alleged use of private investigators, alleged cultivation of sources close to royals and celebrities, methods that, if confirmed in court, amounted to serious violations of privacy and the law. Harry appeared in court himself. He gave oral testimony. This was something palace advisors, by all credible accounts, would never have encouraged. Sitting in a witness box and being cross-examined is the opposite of controlled communication. It is exposure. It is vulnerability. It meant that his credibility, his memory, his consistency would all be tested publicly by lawyers whose job was to undermine them. He did it anyway, and observers who were in the courtroom that day described a man who seemed, whatever his faults or inconsistencies, to genuinely believe in what he was doing. The settlement, when it came, was announced in early 2024. News Group newspapers settled Harry's claims. They issued an apology, publicly, formally, on record. The statement acknowledged that he had been subjected to unlawful activities by journalists and private investigators working for the publications. For a man who had been told by advisors, by institutions, by lawyers, by critics, and by commentators for years that he was unlikely to win, that he was tilting at windmills, that settling was the pragmatic choice, the apology was not nothing. It was the thing he had said he wanted, a public acknowledgement, words on paper, an institution saying in plain English that it had done wrong. Whether that felt like victory is something only Harry knows. What the world observed was a man who looked not triumphant, not celebratory, but tired, resolved, the particular expression of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and finally set it down, only to discover that the carrying had changed the shape of their hands, because here is what the years of litigation had cost alongside what they won. The distance from his family had grown. The relationship with his father, King Charles, was described by sources close to both sides as strained, cautious, maintained through occasional contact but not repaired in any substantive sense. The relationship with his brother, the Prince of Wales, was characterized by those familiar with the situation as even more complicated. Two men who had once been photographed laughing together, walking together, side by side at every public occasion, now occupying separate worlds so distant from each other that royal watchers could go months without seeing them in the same photograph. there is a particular cruelty in estrangement between brothers. It is different from the estrangement between a child and a parent, which carries its own freight of blame and history. Between siblings, especially siblings who were as close as these two were reported to be in their 20s, there is an added layer. They shared the same loss. They walked behind the same coffin. They sat in the same rooms during the same silences after their mother died. That shared experience was supposed to be a bond that nothing could entirely sever. What the last several years have made visible is how much more than bonds family requires. It requires presence, agreement, a shared understanding of what loyalty demands and what it costs. Somewhere in the distance between London and California, between working royal and private citizen, between the version of things Harry has told publicly and whatever version lives in William's memory, that understanding broke down. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 had offered what many hoped would be a moment of reconciliation. Harry had returned to Britain. He had stood with his brother and father in public. There had been moments, a walk together at Windsor, the shared experience of grief, that led observers to wonder whether proximity might rebuild what distance had eroded. But the months that followed suggested those hopes were premature. The Netflix documentary, the memoir, the interviews. Each new release renewed tensions rather than resolving them. Each pulled the family further into the kind of public examination that the institution has always found most threatening. The palace did not respond publicly to most of what Harry said. This is consistent with royal communication strategy. Don't engage, don't confirm, don't amplify. But silence carries its own message, and the silence of his family through years of public revelations was, to those watching from outside, one of the more painful things to witness. A son describing what he experienced. A father saying nothing. A brother saying nothing. The chasm in that nothing is not nothing. Harry and Meghan settled in California with their two children, Archie and Lilibet. They built a life that looks, from the outside, like the kind of life many people would envy. A house in Montecito, meaningful work, proximity to nature, privacy that the British tabloids could no longer easily breach. Their Archewell Foundation pursued charitable work. Meghan launched projects. Harry wrote. He gave speeches on topics he cares about: veterans' mental health, the well-being of children, the ethics of media. And yet, those familiar with the couple's situation have consistently noted a gap between the image of liberation and the reality of what was lost. Harry had hoped, it is widely reported, to maintain some connection to his royal role, to visit Britain, to maintain public duties, to be a part of the institution in some form while building something separate from it. What he got instead was a clean break that neither side appears to have entirely chosen. The security dispute over whether Harry and Meghan would retain police protection during visits to the UK became one of the most practically significant and emotionally loaded conflicts of the years that followed. Without that protection, Harry said in public and in court documents, visits to Britain felt genuinely dangerous given the threats he believed existed. The government's position, through the Home Office, was that decisions about protective security for non-working royals would follow established procedures. The standoff became another legal battle, another headline, another reason he rarely came back. What this means for a man who grew up in Britain, who was formed by it, who carries the memory of walking behind his mother's coffin through its streets, the emotional weight of that distance is not something any outsider can fully measure. What can be observed is that when Harry does speak about home, about Britain, about his family, there is something in the language that goes beyond anger. There is something that sounds like grief. He said, in more than one context, that he had hoped for a different outcome. that he had hoped the institution would change, that he had hoped his family would understand why he felt he had no choice but to do what he did. Royal observers, who have tracked his public statements over the years, note a consistent undercurrent in all of them. Not the desire to burn things down, but the desire to be believed, to have his experience acknowledged by the people who were closest to it. That acknowledgement never came in any public form, and so the distance remained. What the end of the legal campaign against the press means, practically, is that the formal battlefield has gone quiet. There are no active cases. The courts have ruled where they ruled. The settlements have been signed. The apologies, however carefully worded, are in the public record. By the measures Harry himself laid out, he wanted accountability. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the methods documented. He achieved something real, more than most people who have fought the British tabloid press ever achieved. What it doesn't mean is that the underlying tensions have resolved. The press still covers him. Some of that coverage is still hostile. The relationship between Harry and the British media is not warm and is unlikely to become warm. But the nature of the fight has changed. He is no longer a working royal whose every movement is catalogued. He is no longer an active litigant with cases pending. He is a private individual insofar as anyone in his position is ever truly private, living on the other side of the world, outside the orbit of the institution that formed him. Whether that is freedom or exile depends on how you look at it, and perhaps that is the most honest thing to say about the whole of Harry's journey since 2020. It depends on how you look at it. His supporters see a man who had the courage to leave an institution that was harming him and to fight in the courts rather than suffer in silence. His critics see a man who walked away from duty, aired family grievances in public, and undermined an institution that had spent his entire life providing the platform on which he stood. Both of these things contain partial truths. Neither of them is complete. And the lived reality of being Harry himself, the actual felt experience of the last 6 years, is something that no documentary, no memoir, no interview has fully captured, because the full interior of any human life resists capture. What we can see from the outside is a man at a particular kind of crossroads. The fighting is done. The legal argument is over. The books and the documentaries have been made. What comes next is less clear. Sources close to the couple have suggested Harry has been considering where his public role goes from here, what causes he wants to champion, what his life looks like without the adversarial structure of legal battles and press confrontations to organize his energy around. There are reports of charitable work, of projects in development, of a life being built piece by piece. There are also reports of longing for connection, for family, for the country he grew up in. He turned 40 years old in September 2024. His father was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024, a diagnosis that King Charles confirmed publicly and which prompted Harry to travel to the UK for a brief visit. The two men met. The meeting was private. Nothing of what was said between them has been confirmed by anyone who was there. What was observed was simply that it happened. A son visiting a father who was ill, inside a relationship that has been publicly fractured and privately tested in ways most families never experience. Whatever passed between them in that room belongs only to them. But the fact that Harry got on a plane, that Charles opened a door, that small, physical fact is not nothing. He was in Britain again for other reasons in 2024, including hearings related to his legal cases. Each time, the coverage noted not just what he did, but how he looked, whether he seemed at ease, whether he seemed lonely, whether his face showed something about the interior state that his carefully managed public appearances usually conceal. Royal observers read him the way they always have, looking for the signal beneath the surface. Whether they find what is actually there or construct their own narrative is, as always, hard to say. There is also the question of his children. Archie and Lilibet are growing up in California, far from the country that carries their family name, far from the ceremonies and the palaces and the weight of 1,000 years of continuity that their father left behind. They will grow up knowing who they are, in the sense that their parents can give them, in the private daily sense, in the values and the stories and the choices made on their behalf. What they will not have, at least not in any ordinary way, is proximity to the institution their grandfather leads. They will not grow up, as their father did, walking those corridors and absorbing by osmosis what it means to carry that particular inheritance. Whether their parents see that as a loss or a gift, or some complicated mixture of both that changes depending on the day, is something only they can say. What is verifiable is this: the man who stepped into that courtroom to fight the press did so alone, without institutional backing, without the armor of royal duty, and without any guarantee of outcome. He did it at a time when he had already given up the protections and platforms that his royal role provided. He did it while living in a foreign country thousands of miles from everyone he grew up with, and he did it by all accounts because he felt he had no alternative, that the alternative was to let the story told about him and his family go unchallenged forever. That is not a story about a prince losing his war. It is a story about a person deciding what they were willing to live with. It is also, in a broader sense, a story about the British press and what accountability looks like when it finally arrives. The phone hacking scandal produced criminal convictions, a public inquiry, and an enormous amount of editorial self-examination. It also produced, in many quarters, a quiet return to business as usual. The tabloid culture that Harry spent years fighting did not disappear because courts found against it. Cultures rarely do. What the legal victories achieved was something narrower and, in some ways, more durable. A paper trail, evidence in the public record, findings by judges that specific things were done to a specific person without his consent and against the law. That paper trail doesn't change the culture, but it makes the culture harder to deny. And for Harry, who spent years being told that his concerns were exaggerated, that he was paranoid, that the press was merely doing its job, that documented record may matter more than any headline about winners and losers. There is a photograph that circulated widely in the years around 2019, taken at some official engagement or another. In it, Harry is smiling the smile that royals learn in childhood, wide, practice, calibrated for cameras. But his eyes are doing something different from his mouth. They are somewhere else. Anyone who has spent time looking at photographs of public figures under private pressure knows that expression. It is the expression of someone present in body and absent everywhere else. Someone performing the version of themselves that the occasion requires, while the real version waits somewhere behind the eyes for a moment that never comes. Whatever the costs of the last 6 years, and they have been real, and they have been significant, and they are not over. Harry no longer wears that expression in photographs. He wears other things. Sometimes tension, sometimes fatigue, sometimes a quality that is harder to name, something like the steadiness of a person who has stopped pretending. Whether what replaced the performance is happiness is something no one outside his life can determine. But it is, at the very least, something true. That might be the most honest measure of where he stands now. Not whether he won or lost. Not whether the press was defeated or the palace was embarrassed or the tabloids were finally held to account. Whether, after everything, the man behind the smile has found a way to simply exist without performing. Whether, after a childhood spent carrying the weight of everyone else's narrative about who he should be, he has found something that belongs only to him. The courtrooms are quiet. The legal war is over. The institution continues, as institutions do, without skipping a beat. And somewhere in California, a 40-year-old man who grew up in palaces is raising his children far from the cameras, far from the protocol, far from the family he left and the country that formed him, in a life that doesn't look like anything the institution planned for him. Whatever you call that, it isn't nothing. It might even in time turn out to be enough.